Kanawha State Forest stretches for miles, thick with towering trees and narrow trails that weave deep into the wilderness. Hikers know it as a peaceful escape from city life, a place where the only sounds are the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal. But for those who've dared to camp too far from the beaten path, the forest holds something else. Something that watches. It was late October when a lone camper decided to spend a night deep in the woods, far beyond where most hikers venture. He was experienced, had camped alone plenty of times before, and knew the area well. The kind of person who wasn't easily shaken. The day had been uneventful, just the usual hike, setting up camp, and gathering firewood before the sun dipped behind the hills. By dusk, the air had turned crisp, and the glow of his fire flickered against the surrounding trees. He sat beside it, listening to the quiet, enjoying the solitude. But as the minutes stretched on, he realized it was too quiet. No insects buzzing, no distant hoot of an owl, just the crackling fire and his own breathing. He told himself it was normal. Maybe the colder air had settled in and silenced the usual nighttime sounds. But deep down, something about it felt wrong. Still, he brushed it off, ate his dinner, fed another log to the fire. Then came the first sound. A low, guttural noise, distant enough that he couldn't place what it was. Not a coyote, not a bear, something different. He paused, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. Minutes passed, then another noise. This time it was closer, a deep, rumbling grunt that seemed to vibrate through the trees. His skin prickled. He knew the animals in this area, had encountered plenty of wildlife before, but nothing that made a sound like that. He stood, shining his flashlight into the woods, sweeping it slowly across the trees. Nothing. Just the skeletal shapes of branches swaying slightly in the night breeze. Maybe he was imagining things. But then, something moved. Not a rabbit darting through the underbrush, not the flutter of an owl shifting on a branch. This was heavier, slow, deliberate footfalls, not crashing through the woods like a deer, just steady steps. They stopped. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tense, waiting. Then a branch snapped. This time, he knew it wasn't his imagination. His fire cast just enough light to see the outline of the trees, but beyond that, darkness. He kept his flashlight trained in that direction, stomach twisting as he tried to make sense of what was out there. And then he saw it. Just for a second. A shape, tall, broader than any man, standing between the trees. The light barely touched it before it shifted, melting into the shadows like it had never been there at all. A cold sweat crept over his skin. His instincts screamed at him to pack up and go, but something about the way it moved, the way it just watched, kept him frozen in place. Then another sound. A deep, slow exhale. Closer than before. His mind raced. There was no way this was a bear. No way it was another camper. He would have heard them long before now. And then the worst sound yet. A low, deep clicking noise like two stones tapping together. It came from the same spot he'd seen the shape. And then another click. Off to his right. Behind him. He wasn't alone. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to move. He grabbed his bag, not bothering to pack properly, and backed toward the trail. His flashlight beam darted through the trees, but whatever was out there stayed just beyond its reach. He could hear it moving, keeping pace with him, just out of sight. The clicking sounds followed him for the first half mile, always just far enough that he couldn't see their source. He didn't stop, didn't look back. By the time he reached his car, the forest was silent again. The next day, he told himself he'd overreacted. Maybe it had been another camper playing a prank. Maybe his mind had played tricks on him in the dark. But there was one thing he couldn't explain. When he got home, he emptied his bag to repack his gear. At the bottom, nestled between his clothes, was a small, smooth stone, a stone he knew he hadn't packed. The Smoky Mountains have always been a place of quiet beauty. Rolling mist over the hills, the scent of damp earth, the distant sound of a creek cutting through the woods. But for those who live near the deep trails, there are stories. Not the kind tourists hear. Stories of things that move in the night, things that don't belong. A man who lived on the edge of the forest had heard those stories his whole life. He never paid them much attention until last fall when he set up a trail camera near the back of his property. He wasn't looking for anything strange, just deer, maybe the occasional bear wandering close to the house. The camera was motion activated, set to record in the middle of the night. For the first few weeks, it captured the usual: a few raccoons, some distant coyotes, even a buck stepping cautiously through the trees. But then, one night, the footage was different. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a still frame of the woods, the trees stretching high, the undergrowth dense and dark. But something was off. There was a shape in the trees, not an animal, not a person, something taller, thinner, standing too still. He stared at the image for a long time, convincing himself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast in just the right way. But the next frame shattered that thought completely. The figure had moved, not closer, not away, just shifted. As if it had turned slightly, just enough that the outline was clearer now. The head was wrong, too narrow, the shoulders too sharp. No visible eyes, no clear face. He flipped to the next frame. Now it was closer. Not by much, but enough. It hadn't walked. It hadn't stepped forward. It had just appeared closer, like it had flickered through the trees without making a sound. There were only a few more frames before the footage ended. Each one showed the same thing. Closer, stiller, closer again, until the final frame. The camera had malfunctioned. The screen was nothing but static, the last image distorted. But buried within the fuzz of broken pixels, he swore he could still see the figure, standing right in front of the camera. The next morning, he walked out to where the camera had been. The trees were the same, the ground undisturbed, but the camera was gone. He searched the area, checked the brush, even climbed into the trees to see if it had fallen somewhere. Nothing. It never turned up. A few weeks later, he bought another camera, but this time he never set it up, because sometimes it's better not to see what's out there. There are stories that lose their weight with time, tales that over the years become nothing more than folklore, their edges dulled by retellings and exaggeration. But some stories refuse to fade. Some remain as sharp as the day they were first spoken. The story of the Bell Witch is one of them. In the early 19th century, the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, became the unwilling hosts of something that defied explanation. It did not lurk in the shadows like a ghost, nor remain unseen like an unsettled spirit. It was something else, something with a voice, a will, and a deep, burning hatred for those who crossed its path. John Bell was a respected farmer, a man of reason and faith, but neither could protect him from what came to his home. It started subtly, the way most hauntings do. Faint knocking against the walls in the dead of night, the rustling of fabric in empty rooms, doors left open that no one remembered touching. The family dismissed it at first, blaming animals or their own imaginations. But then the whispers began, low and curling through the air like a breeze that should not be there. The Bell children spoke of an unseen force tugging at their blankets as they slept, of laughter that was not their own echoing in the halls. The livestock grew restless, the dogs barked at nothing, and an unease settled over the land like an unshakable fog. Then the voice came. It was clear, deliberate, and mocking. It spoke as if it had always been there, as if it had been waiting. It called itself the Witch, though it had no face, no shape, only sound, only presence. At first, it was a trickster, moving objects with unnatural force, slamming doors, pulling chairs across the floor, shattering plates with invisible hands. But it did not stop at mischief. It became violent. The children woke with handprints seared into their skin, red welts forming where unseen fingers had gripped too tightly. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, suffered the worst. The entity tormented her relentlessly, slapping her, pulling her hair, whispering cruel taunts in her ear as she tried to sleep. She would wake screaming, her face streaked with fresh tears, her body shaking with something beyond fear. The family sought help from neighbors, but the witch did not fear outsiders. It spoke to them as well, laughing, taunting, proving its existence beyond a shadow of a doubt. Word spread, and soon, even General Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States, came to witness the phenomenon. He arrived with a group of men, armed and skeptical. But as night fell, the unseen force made itself known. Jackson's men were thrown from their horses by something unseen. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, and an eerie voice whispered threats from the darkness. By morning, the men were desperate to leave. Jackson himself, despite his reputation for fearlessness, admitted that whatever haunted the Bell family was beyond human understanding. They fled before the sun had fully risen, never to return. But the Bell family could not leave. The witch had made them its own. John Bell grew weaker by the day. His body betrayed him, his movements slow and labored. The witch tormented him endlessly, calling for his death, vowing that he would not find peace. And then, one cold morning, he did not wake. His family found him in his bed, cold, his face twisted as if he had seen something terrible before his final breath. Near his bedside was a strange vial, one that no one in the family recognized. The witch laughed as they found it, its voice ringing through the empty spaces of the house. It claimed responsibility. The liquid was tested on a cat. Within seconds, the animal convulsed and died. The witch had poisoned John Bell, just as it had promised. Even after his death, the witch did not leave. It lingered, reveling in its victory, boasting of its power. It spoke of distant lands, of places it had traveled, as if it were something far older than anyone had imagined. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The house fell silent, the laughter stopped, the shadows, once alive, became still. But the Bell Witch never truly faded. It promised to return in 7 years. True to its word, it did. Though the visit was brief, a whisper on the wind, a shadow in the corner of the room. It spoke again of its power, of things yet to come, and then it disappeared once more. Even now, its legend endures, passed down in hushed voices, retold around flickering candlelight. Some say the land remains cursed, that echoes of the witch's voice can still be heard in the fields at night. Others claim it never left at all, only waits, watching, listening. Because once something like the Bell Witch finds a home, it never really leaves.